This is Channel Attitude. Your voice, your right, your freedom. This is Vince Russo's The Brand.
Welcome everybody to a very, very special show. I was just telling my guest, I don't wear special clothing for anybody. But when I do this show, I got to wear this shirt. Yes, Paul is dead if you want it. Guys, I gotta be honest with you. You know, I don't do many interviews anymore because, you know, just interviewing wrestlers, they're always going to toe a line. They're never going to be honest. And like, I don't want anybody, I can't waste my time at this point in my life. Every minute counts at this point in my life. So I don't do many interviews. But when I can get this next guest, I stop everything. This man is a genius. I have labeled this man a genius, and not just because of his work in the Paul is dead category, but just the mind. We've had many talks. He's been on the show a few times. I love him. We got some heartbreaking news, though, that I'm going to try to talk him out of. That's part of what this show is about. Listen, here he is. The great Mike Williams. Mike, you ever get an introduction like that in your life, Mike?
Never.
Mike, who's your biggest fan? Mike, you know I'm your biggest fan, Mike.
I hope I can live up to that, Vince.
Mike, what is going on? I was watching, you know, one of your shows a couple of months ago, and you had an end date. Now, Mike, we've had end dates before. We've had you're like the wrestler that had the last match, the retirement match. But Mike, you said, nope. Matter of fact, this is it. And I said, first of all, I'm going to try to talk him out of this. Second of all, if it is the truth, I got to have you on the show before that happens. So, Mike, what wasn't the date November something? That's why we're doing the show today.
Well, tomorrow is the last day. I told my audience that it's the last day that I will do the ongoing day-to-day research, Vince. What I've explained is that I will continue to do periodically interviews. If a host contacts me and wants to talk about my Beatles research, I'll certainly do that. But the ongoing research, day in, day out stuff, after 8 years, it's a long time. And I felt that I really was able to communicate out everything that I needed to with regard to my research. And 8 years is long enough to do just about anything. And so I want to move on to other things. I have a big music project right now that my brother and I are working on. We have 2 grandchildren now. And so, you know, there are priorities in life, and sometimes you have to shift them up.
Yeah. Well, you know, Mike, the word on the street, the rumor on the street is you're planning a new show. Called Avril Lavigne is Dead. Is that going to be your next series? Mike, I got to tell you this, though. First of all, when you talk about the 8 years, guys, listen, I don't know if you've ever been to Sage of Quay. You need to go to Mike's site, Sage of Quay. Mike, the research and the slideshows and the presentations, they're nothing like it have I ever seen with any topic being covered. Your thoroughness, like, is absolutely amazing. And that's what I'm talking about. I mean, when you talk about 8 years, it's really 16 years with the amount of time, because so much of this took so much time. This isn't about, okay, everybody, pull out Sergeant Pepper and there's a hand over Paul's head. No. As a matter of fact, Mike, I want to throw this at you. I have a feeling through your 8 years of doing this, there was the presentation of Paul is Dead. You know, we went through all that very thoroughly. However, I think you may have stumbled upon something that almost superseded that, and maybe something you didn't even plan on stumbling upon. I don't think you did. And that is when you started, you took a little bit of right, and the Beatles don't write their own music. And
Right.
you got into that so heavily and so convincing. I think all that started with Rubber Soul, was written and produced in 21 days or something like that. And then all of a sudden, Mike, you took a right and you put together, I think it was like an 8-hour presentation. I watched over a week. Mike, was that something that you expected as you started getting into the Paul is Dead research?
No. When I first got into it, my research started off like most people's research, is to take a look and to see if you could figure out if Paul was replaced. So I knew of the rumor, Vince, going back to the 1970s, actually the mid 1970s, when I was in high school. And but I didn't believe the rumor. I believe that it was just a very clever and witty marketing ploy. Because as I've mentioned on other shows, that's how the Beatles are sold to us, as very clever and witty, and that they were engaging with their fans, and one of the premises being that it would give an uptick to sales, which actually it did. So when I bought the Memoirs of Billy Shears going back to 2016, and the book has been out since 2009, so I was 7 years late to the party, I was still a believer that Paul was always Paul. And so when I was reading the book, and as you know, you've read the book too, there's so much information in it that I concluded that the only way this much information can be in the book is that it either has to be coming from somebody within the inner circle of the Beatles enterprise, or it's coming from the person that's playing the role of Paul McCartney, who I refer to as Billy Shears. And so that was basically phase one of my research. Was Paul replaced or not? And then once I concluded that he was, and the evidence is really overwhelming that he was. I know there's people listening to us right now that will disagree and so on and say that was just a rumor from years ago, but there's just so much more to the story than what most people believe, Beatle fans, as it pertains to the whole Paul is Dead conspiracy. But what happened was there was a couple of sentences on page 350 going into page 351 of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, where it said something to the effect that George Martin was going to take their little songs and make them great. And I remember reading that passage and thinking to myself, what does that mean? Because the book, generally speaking, discusses the Beatles in terms of them writing their own songs. Now, after I did my presentation, my 4-hour presentation, did the Beatles write all their own music, going back to April of 2020, that's when the footnotes were added to the Memoirs of Billy Shears that validated my research, that the Beatles did not write all of their own music and they did not play on all of their recorded tracks. So we can get into that in some more detail later if you wish. And then on page 351, after it said that George Martin was going to take their little songs and make them great, it started talking about the Committee of 300 and the Snitch. And I knew of the Committee of 300, and I knew of Dr. John Coleman. I had not read the book at that time, but I knew of John Coleman because Coleman did interviews. And as I was going through my whole period of looking into alternative research and conspiracy research, and I've had my blog since 2011 or 2012, I ran across Dr. Coleman's interviews. So when the book mentioned that, I knew that they were talking about John Coleman. So I bought the book, The Committee of 300, which I highly recommend. It's a great book on the deep state. And in that book, which is not a book about the Beatles, it's about the deep state, it's about the Committee of 300, Tavistock, and the other organizations within the controlling matrix that plug in. He mentions the Beatles being a creation of the Tavistock Institute. And for those that are not familiar, Tavistock is the social engineering hub of the deep state. So all of the social engineering, the propaganda, the mind control, and all that stuff, that all emanates out of the Tavistock Institute, which is located in London. So Coleman mentions this about 6 or 7 times in the book, based upon different contexts with regard to what he's discussing in that particular chapter. And so I said, okay, let me buy the book, and I read it. And Coleman very explicitly states that the Beatles were a creation of Tavistock. Now, John Coleman claims that he was part of British intelligence, and he was a whistleblower, and he defected. So in case anybody's asking, why should we believe John Coleman? So even at that point, I was thinking, okay, I have a lot of respect for Coleman's work, but I don't know if this is true. In fact, there's one thing that Coleman claims in the book that I did disagree with. He said that Theodore Adorno from the Frankfurt School, now the Frankfurt School and the Tavistock Institute are connected at the hip. They both came into being in the early 1920s. And when I looked into Adorno and everything he was involved in, I concluded after doing the research that it's unlikely that he wrote all of their music. It's not to say that Theodore Adorno did not write some of the music, along with George Martin, by the way. I believe George Martin was a big contributor toward the writing of Beatles songs, along with maybe a half dozen crack songwriters on the EMI Tavistock staff that were assigned to the Beatles project, because the Beatles were a psychological operation that Tavistock implemented in order to social engineer the masses worldwide. So the Beatles were the first manufactured band with the mission to social engineer at a worldwide level. So I started digging into these deep state organizations like Tavistock, learning about what Tavistock is all about, the Frankfurt School, the Committee of 300. You start getting into other factions of the deep state matrix, like the Club of Rome, the World Economic Forum, Bilderberg, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, and so on. So there's an entire structure, folks, that's there, that is above us, that's running this world. And the system that you think is running the world is nothing more than just a show. It's a veneer to keep you occupied and entertained with what's going on down here while they're working up here doing all the stuff that they believe they need to do to get to their one world order, the new world order. So that's what happened, and I got into it, and the silver bullet was Rubber Soul, as you mentioned, Vince. And so what happened was I bought a DVD going back a number of years ago, 5 years ago or so, and the author of the DVD is a gentleman by the name of Scott Fryman, and Scott Fryman is a musicologist. He's very accomplished as a musician, and he presents the Beatles' official narrative. And so he has this series called Deconstructing the Beatles. Mm-hmm. And underneath that, he deconstructs the different albums that the Beatles have put out. So I don't even remember how I stumbled upon Scott's series, but I did. And a little voice in my head said, look at Rubber Soul. So I took a look at Rubber Soul, and I got about 15 minutes into the presentation, because the premise, he's setting it up, and he said that the Beatles came into the studio on October 11th of 1965 to do the Rubber Soul recordings, with essentially no backlog of music. In fact, I think what Scott's exact words were, they came in empty. They had just come off a tour. Mm-hmm. They had a 6-week break between when the tour ended on August 31st of 65 to when they had to head over to EMI Studios October 11th of 65. Recording actually started on October 12th, the next day. And the premise kicks off by saying that the Beatles were on the hook to write 16 songs in 30 days. So that's 14 songs for the album and a double A-side single, which was Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. But they had no music coming in. Now, some pieces of the official narrative will say that the Beatles had a little bit of this song, a little bit of that, like a little bit of Michelle, a little bit of We Can Work It Out. But they were, if we go by the official narrative, they were partial songs. And that's great, but partial songs still have to be developed and worked on in the studio. And some people want to argue with me and say, well, it wasn't 16 songs. It was something less. In Mark Lewison's book, Mark is considered the Beatles historian from an official narrative perspective, he claims that they had to write from scratch more than a dozen songs. So even if we go with Mark's number, more than a dozen, which means they had to write 13, 14, 15, or 16 songs, that task of writing that many songs within a 30-day period of time is not possible. Because when you break it down, I'm a songwriter, musician and a songwriter, and I record. I'm very familiar with the recording process. I've been at it since the late 1970s. When you write a song, there's a twofold aspect to it. You've got to write the music, and then you have to write the lyrics. So, and both these things typically don't come simultaneously. You might have some scratch lyrics that you're going to play around with as you're working the melody of the music, and then you're going to fix up the lyrics later on. Sometimes you might have some lyrics, and then you have to create the music. But the point being is, music is a creative process. It's not a manufacturing process like we're pumping out widgets, right, on a conveyor belt. So when you write a song, you're going to have to write the song, and then once you write it, once you're satisfied that you've got something that is worthy of recording, you're then going to take it to your band members, and they have to learn it. So as an example, in the case of Rubber Soul, if Paul McCartney and John Lennon wrote a song, and George and Ringo were doing something else, John and or Paul would have to take it to George and Ringo and say, hey, here's the song, and so here's how it goes. And then they would play around with the song, they would rehearse the song, and the rehearsal process in itself means that there's going to be the dynamic of give and take between the band members, unless you have a dictatorial situation. So what's going to happen is you're going to say, okay, the song goes like this, let's play it. They run through it. And then George Harrison might say, hey, I have an idea. Why don't we try this lick here, this riff there?
And Mike, you saw the process in Get Back.
Yes.
You see the process Mike is talking about, you see in Get Back. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
That's the exact process. And so once you rehearse, there's going to be changes. And then there's the process of arranging the song. So arranging would be how the song is ultimately presented. It could mean that you're going to change verses, you're going to change a bridge, you're going to maybe delete a bridge, you're going to do this to the chorus, you're going to layer the song with different types of overdubs, maybe orchestration, and so on, lead guitar playing, and there's all of that. And then once you get all that down, then you go record the song. If the overdubs come later, but you're going to go in and record the song. And then after that, once the song is recorded, you mix it. So a lot of people, lay people who really don't understand music and they don't understand songwriting and recording will make a very simplistic statement, right? Their defense will be of the Beatles, well, they were geniuses and they can do what other people couldn't do. And, that's really just a cop-out, right? Because they were not geniuses. In fact, the Beatles themselves, if you listen to their interviews, never said once that they were geniuses. And John Lennon said on a number of occasions that they couldn't read or write music. And some people want to argue, well, you don't have to read and write music to be able to write music. That's true. But when we take a look at the quality and the intricacies of the Beatles' music, all the arrangements and all that stuff, you have to ask yourself, well, who was doing that? people would say, oh, that was George Martin. Well, yeah, you're probably right that it was George Martin, and maybe Theodore Adorno had a hand in it as well. But once you start getting into those discussions, what happens is now you're starting to open the aperture to that there's a whole lot more to the story than just the Beatles,
Right.
than just four guys. Because now you have, George Martin was doing this, and maybe Theodore Adorno was doing that. Also, we have, I have video footage of Glenn Campbell as an example. He was co-hosting the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour back in July of 1968. And so Glenn was introducing the band Cream, which is Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce. Mm-hmm. And when he introduced the band, he said that they were top flight, top shelf studio musicians. They were the cream of the crop, and that they played on many, many records coming out of the UK. And Glenn went on to say the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and he rattled off a couple of other acts. So here we have Glenn Campbell, who was a guitar virtuoso. He played for the Wrecking Crew. The Wrecking Crew was responsible for most of the pop rock music recordings back in the 1960s and 1970s here in the U.S. I'm almost positive they also played on UK releases. But the UK had their own version of these studio players. Mm-hmm. So here we have a situation where Glenn Campbell comes out and says, well, the members of Cream played on Beatle tracks. They recorded on Beatle tracks. And I've had not arguments, but people will want to argue with me and say, well, he meant that was Eric Clapton playing on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I said, no, it doesn't mean that.
Yeah.
Eric wasn't asked by George Harrison to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps until September of 1968. Glenn Campbell made his comment in July of 1968.
Yeah.
Right. We also have a situation where Paul McCartney or Billy did a show, a special with Rick Rubin, and it was a Hulu special, McCartney 321. Mm-hmm. And during that special, Rick Rubin brings up While My Guitar Gently Weeps and isolates the bass track. And as he isolates the bass track, Billy or Paul McCartney is sitting there, and you can easily tell that he didn't play on that track, because his reaction to what Rick was showing him, he was as amazed and as inspired by it,
right,
as Rick was.
Right.
And Rick was going on about the tone and the aggressiveness of the bass playing. And what was interesting is, as Rick is taking him through this and discussing it, not once does Paul or Billy, I'll call him Billy, ever say, well, I got the tone this way. I used this bass. I used this amp with these settings. Not 1 ounce of input to help to understand how that bass track was put together. So what that told me was that he didn't play bass on that song. So we had Eric Clapton playing lead guitar on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And I'm thinking, well, does that mean Jack Bruce played the bass?
Yeah, right.
And then, of course, we have Bernard Purdie. And Bernard, since 1978, has said and stated very clearly that
the drummer, right? He's the drummer, right?
He's the legendary drummer he drummed for Aretha Franklin for 25 years. He's played for Steely Dan, the Rolling Stones, the list goes on and on and on. Bernard is probably one of the most sought after studio drummers of all time. And he's in the Drummers Hall of Fame. And he came out in 78 and said that he drummed on 21 Beatle tracks from the early albums. And so when we talk about the early albums, we're talking about Please Please Me with the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night. And maybe it could have gotten into Beatles for Sale, which was their 4th UK release. And Bernard has never backed off that. And again, people want to argue and say, well, no, he fixed the tracks on the Tony Sheridan songs that the Beatles recorded. The Beatles did some recordings with Tony Sheridan. Mm-hmm. And he also did that. So what I have to explain to people that don't want to give up the the myth is that Bernard drummed on both. He drummed on some of the Tony Sheridan tracks. He was called in to fix the tracks, which means he went in to fix the drumming tracks to make them a little more powerful, have more presence, better timing. And he also drummed on 21 Beatle tracks, aside from the Tony Sheridan tracks.
Yeah.
So what we have is, so going back, and the reason why I brought that up, folks, is because people will ask for examples of other musicians playing on Beatle tracks. I was told by a person that that I communicate with, I'll just refer to him as a source, who was a very good friend of Dan Peake. Now, Dan Peake was one of the founding members of the band America. And they were also produced by George Martin. Now, Dan passed away going back around, I guess, 10, 12 years ago. But this person who knows him very, very well, knew him very, very well, said to me that Dan, again, America was produced by George Martin. The Beatles were also produced by George Martin. Told him that Jimmy Page played the lead on I Saw Her Standing There. So Jimmy Page was one of the studio players playing on Beatle albums, along with Vic Flick. Vic Flick was in the George Martin Orchestra. So if we watch A Hard Day's Night, we have Ringo's theme from the soundtrack. Mm-hmm. That, of course, wasn't the Beatles, but that was Vic Flick who played the guitar on Ringo's theme for the movie. And he also played the James Bond sounding theme at the beginning of the United Artists release of Help here in America. Before the song starts, there's kind of that James Bond guitar playing. That was Vic Flick as well. I was told by a person that is a relative of the late, great studio drummer Ronnie Verrill out of the UK, that Ronnie also drummed on Beatles songs. And the official narrative tells us that Andy Wyatt, of course, drummed on P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do back in 1962. But another Beatles researcher reached out to me, and their day job, I guess, is doing electrical work. And so they ran into a drummer. I'm not going to say who it is because I don't want to bring people into this stuff that, it could wind up being a problem for them. He said that it's absolutely true that Bernard Purdy drummed on those 21 Beatle tracks. He knew Bernard personally. And also that another Beatle drummer was Alan White from the band Yes, who also later drummed for John Lennon for the Plastic Ono Band. Mm-hmm. And we also have to remember, too, to kind of add a little more spice to this, Phil Spector was with the Wrecking Crew. And so we see that Phil Spector was involved with the Beatles, especially with the Get Back, not the Get Back sessions, but the Let It Be album. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Let It Be, and that's interesting because when John Lennon was asked about the Let It Be album, he said that they handed Phil Spector a big pile of shit, John's words, and he did something with it. So John was saying, Phil did a great job. We handed him a bunch of junk, a pile of junk from a recording perspective, and he worked it as a producer and engineer to create the Let It Be album. That was the album that was released in 1970. So you have all these connection points. So this is, like I said, this is important because information is out there with regard to people who are that were involved with the Beatles from a recording perspective. Nicky Hopkins, the great keyboard player. Nicky Hopkins, a lot of people probably don't know this. The piano playing that you're hearing on the song Revolution, that's Nicky Hopkins. How do we know that? Well, Nicky's passed away, but if you go to his website, it says Nicky Hopkins played piano on Revolution. So the point being is we have these guys, the Beatles, these four kids really, to be able to write 10, 12, 14, 16 songs, Vince. And like I said, that's not just the music, but we're talking about the lyrics as well. It's all got to come together in 30 days from October 11th of 1965 through November 11th of 1965 is just not possible.
Well, the thing I remember too, Mike, and you didn't even touch upon this, which was really fascinating to me, was the actual manufacturing of the album and the labels,
Right.
and when they had to get stuff to the printer. I mean, when you laid that part out, because now that's going further, saying, wait a minute, they had to know the names of these songs.
Right.
They had to know the times of these songs, because the manufacturing schedule alone, there was not enough time to get an album out. Correct?
Yes. So there was two problems with Rubber Soul. So the 16 songs in 30 days is problem number one.
Right.
And a lot of people want to argue that because they just want to make the blanket statement that the Beatles were geniuses and therefore, end of discussion. But the other problem, as you just mentioned, is the manufacturing process. So back in the day, to be able to, the manufacturing process, once the final lacquer is cut. Now, the final lacquer is what is used to start the printing process, the pressing process of the vinyl. So that's why the final lacquer is very, very important. So the time from when the lacquer is finalized to when the record can make its way into retail outlets, and we're talking about back in the day, was 2 months. And 2 months is I don't want to say it's aggressive, but let's just say on average 2 months. Mm-hmm. And maybe not even on average 2 months, and then it could be longer. It could be maybe 9 weeks, 10 weeks, maybe 2.5 months. So, and how did I get this information? Well, when I was doing my presentation, working on it, I was connected into a person who was very accomplished in the music industry out of the UK, has been around for, a long time, and was very familiar with the pressing process of pressing vinyl. And so, I was having dialogue back and forth. We were emailing him, and I would send him some of my slides and show him, this is what I was seeing and how I was understanding it and laying it out. And he would give me his input. And that's how I was able to fine tune it and get it, and I really understand it. So in other words, when the Beatles finished up on November 12th of 1965, and the final lacquer was cut on November 17th of 1965, that album should not have seen the light of day until sometime in late January, at the earliest. But the album was in retail outlets on December 3rd of 1965, in time for the Christmas season, because EMI, of course, didn't want to miss the revenue that was associated with releasing a Beatles album for Christmas. And so the problem is this, and I'll go into a little more detail what Vince was saying. In order to print the album jackets and the center labels, you have to know the names of the songs, and the sequencing has to be done. So the sequencing is what order the songs are going to play on each side of the record, of the 33 RPM album, side A and side B. Sequencing is very important because it's not just something you slap together. There's two pieces to sequencing. One is to determine the flow of the album. This song leads to this song, leads to that song. So there's a flow to an album. The other piece of sequencing is that you have to make sure that the album is balanced on both sides, that there's enough dead wax in front of the label. And the reason why this is important is because with 33 RPM records, if you don't do the sequencing properly and you don't calculate how these songs are going to lay out across side A and side B properly, then there's the possibility of what is referred to as groove distortion on 33 RPM records. So what that means is you have your stylus from your 33 RPM record, and you place song number one, you place the needle down, and it goes across. Now, as the needle is getting closer and closer to the spindle, what's happening is the grooves of the vinyl itself are getting more and more compressed. And so that's where you can get groove distortion. So the record companies back in the day, in order to avoid that, did everything they could to try to lay out the songs properly from a timing perspective and, like I said, enough space between the label and the last song, which is called the dead wax, to ensure that they could minimize groove distortion. Obviously, the higher quality stylus and system that you had, that would help to mitigate any type of groove distortion. But back in the day, a lot of people just had basic phonographs and record players that they were using, turntables. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it's more than just slapping songs together. They have to think through this whole process. So the official narrative tells us that the Beatles finished up recording on November 11th, actually early into the morning, I should say, of November 12th, 2 a.m. or something. And that George Martin completed the sequencing on November 16th. And on November 17th, the final lacquer was cut. And once the final lacquer is cut, that's when they start pressing the records. So the pressing of the records for Rubber Soul either started on November 17th, as soon as the lacquer was finalized, or the very latest, November 18th, the very next day. Okay, so let's go back to the problem. The problem is, let's start with the labels. So if the sequencing wasn't done until November 16th, then how were all of the center labels printed with the proper sequencing or the order of the songs for side A and side B? How did that happen? How did they turn around thousands and thousands and thousands of labels within 24 hours? It's not possible. It's the same thing with the album jacket. The album jacket for any album, but Rubber Soul as well, on the back of it, it lists the songs, side A, side B, in sequenced order. So the album jacket had to be printed with the names of the songs.
Mm-hmm.
So if you finish the sequencing on November 16th and you start pressing on November 17th or the 18th at the very latest, there was absolutely zero time to turn around both the labels and the jackets. Now, the labels in particular are a very important piece to this, because when you press a record, the label, the center label on a 33 RPM album, is pressed at the same time with the label. So the label and the vinyl are pressed at
together
the same time. That's the process. That's the manufacturing process. They don't adhere the labels to the record later. So which means that when they said, okay, we finished the final lacquer, now we're going to make the stampers and we're going to start pressing the records like ASAP, those labels had to be there.
Wow.
They had to be ready to go. So the question becomes, well, all right, so the record obviously got out. It was, the initial shipments of Rubber Soul got out to stores on December 3rd. So how did it work? So what happened was, the whole process of writing the songs was done by outside songwriters. And George Martin had those songs written and recorded by session musicians way before the Beatles ever stepped foot in EMI Studios on October 11th of 1965. And because of that, once the songs were written and George had the studio players in and he recorded the instrumental tracks, then George was able to, and Norman Smith, who was the engineer, to sit down and do whatever edits they needed to do to the songs from an instrumental perspective and complete them. And once they completed them, they now had the run times for the songs. The song was 2.5 minutes long or 3 minutes long. That's what runtime means. So once they had all of the songs written, all of the songs recorded, they had all of the run times, then George Martin could do the sequencing. And he did the sequencing weeks before the Beatles ever stepped foot into the studio. It was at that point, once he had the final sequencing, that they were able to start the printing process and get that manufacturing process going, just to create the labels and to create the album jackets, especially with the names of the songs on the back of it. So that process is underway. The Beatles are not in the studio at this point in time. They're probably still on tour. They're on their vacation, 6-week vacation time, which, by the way, in Mark Lewison's book explains that period of time, there was no songwriting. It was free time. It was vacation. So there was no songs written in that 6-week period of time. That's another argument that people want to make. And I keep telling them, you're making a new narrative, because that's not what the official narrative says. So you're creating your own narrative around this thing in order to kind of, to keep your belief system in place. So that's what happened. So all of that printing and manufacturing process began weeks before the Beatles ever made their way into the studio. So this way, when the Beatles got into the studio on October 11th, the songs were already done, the labels were already done, the album jackets were already done. And the Beatles' job, starting on October 12th, when recording began, they got into the studio on October 11th. October 12th was the first day of recording. Their job was to record the vocal tracks.
Right.
So that means that once they finish up the vocal tracks, George Martin can then take the final vocals with the final instrumentals, which you already had, and mix them together. Now you have the completed song. Now, the other thing we should also talk a little bit about.
I just want to say one thing, Mike, but know what you're going to say, please, because I don't want to interrupt you. But I want everybody to understand, like, there's almost a model for what Mike is talking about, because I've seen many, and I'm sure Mike has too, many Beach Boy documentaries. Okay. Brian Wilson took himself off the road because he wanted to go into the studio full time. This is all documented. You could see footage of this everywhere. What he was creating in the studio was pet sounds. And he was creating that. I don't know, Mike, if it was a Wrecking Crew. I'm sure it probably was.
It was the Wrecking Crew.
With the Wrecking, you see, this is all documented. Everybody is there, full musicians, and Brian Wilson is putting all the music together. Then they show the Beach Boys coming in and dropping the vocal tracks. In this situation, Mike, what we're really talking about is George Martin playing the role of Brian Wilson. I mean, this process had been done before. So it's not like it's some wild, crazy out there. This is how Pet Sounds was made.
Well, what's important to understand is that was the process for pop music in general.
Right.
Studio musicians were used to record the tracks. And there's 2 documentaries. You can watch The Wrecking Crew. I highly recommend it. Yep. Also, Hired Gun, which explains that how a lot of these studio players actually joined bands. So now they're part of the band. And that process really started kicking off in the 1980s. There's also another documentary titled Muscle Shoals. You should watch that too. Muscle Shoals was doing the same thing as the Wrecking Crew, but they were doing it on the East Coast, whereas the Wrecking Crew was LA based. And as I mentioned, the British had their own set of studio players that were paging in and out, like Big Jim Sullivan, Vic Flick, or Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, and so on. So now there's something else we should really focus on here. Back in 1966, in June of 1966, at the Hilton in Japan, the Beatles were all sitting at a table, and they were being asked questions by the press. And a question came up about their musicianship. And during that press conference, Paul McCartney drops a bombshell. He says that we never said we were very good musicians. We're adequate. Okay, that was in June of 1966. And then there was an interview in August of, it was it 6? Yes, it was August of 66, right. So and then 2 months later, August of 66, there was a BBC interview where Paul and John were being interviewed by a BBC interviewer at Paul's house. And Paul says a couple of things. The first thing he says is that we never said we were very good musicians, and we're limited as a group. Now, by him saying that, between that comment he made back in June of 66 in Japan, and then at his home in August of 66, think about that. That interview took place on August 5th of 1966, which was the same day that Revolver, that's the album after Rubber Soul was released. These guys have got 7 albums under their belt at this point in time. We are told that they are great musicians and brilliant songwriters. Why is it that Paul McCartney is restating that they are not very good musicians and they are limited as a group after 7 albums? So 7 albums between 1963 and 1966, that's a lot of output. So in order to have that type of output, you've got to be not adequate. You've got to be extremely competent and good at your trade. So when we go back to Rubber Soul and then banging out 16 songs, actually, well, one of the songs they pulled in, I think it was Wait from the Help sessions, but be that as it may, let's just say 15, 16 songs. In order to do that, to bang those songs out the way they did, one right after another, like I said, it was like a manufacturing process. It was like a conveyor belt. You cannot be just an adequate musician, Vince.
Yeah.
You've got to be a top shelf musician to do that. Now, the other problem with the interview that Paul did in August of 1966, August 5th, is he said that the Beatles did not write songs, music, in between albums. He said maybe 1 or 2. Now, maybe could mean that they wrote 0 music between albums. He said, we wrote in great big batches whenever we had to come in to do an album or a film, but it's really an album because the music from the film was derived from the album. So most Beatle fans, because of the official narrative, believe that the Beatles were constantly writing music. They were a perpetual motion machine of songwriting. They were writing music when they were on film sets. They were writing music when they were in the studio. They were writing music during their free time. They were writing music when they were touring. They were writing music all the time. And in that August 5th, 1966 interview, Paul McCartney just completely blows that out of the sky and says, no, that's not true. So during the interview, when he says that, the BBC interviewer asks, actually states, but it's also a question. He says, well, I would think that writing 12 songs on the spot in such a short period of time is not possible. And John said, well, it is sometimes. And then John and Paul went on to say that for their recent album, and they were referring to Revolver, they said it took them weeks to write just one song for Revolver. Weeks. Now, weeks, folks, obviously is plural. It's more than 1 week for one song. And when we step back to Rubber Soul, they're telling us that they wrote 16 songs in 30 days when it took them weeks to write one song for Revolver. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, with Rubber Soul, if you get all tangled up with 16 songs, pick a number, 12, 14, 16, I don't care. Because whether it's 12 songs or 16 songs, it doesn't work. And so that was a big interview that Paul did. And it's an interview that most people, if they heard it, I don't know whether they ignore what's being said or they're not comprehending what's being said, but he contradicts the official narrative as far as when they wrote songs. And he's saying that, we weren't very good musicians. Also in that interview, he mentioned that they didn't play on Yesterday. He said, we didn't have to show ourselves up again. And my British audience said to me that particular phrase means that they didn't have to embarrass themselves again in the studio. So why is that important? Yeah. Well, that's because Paul McCartney is credited with playing the acoustic guitar on Yesterday. And Paul McCartney in that interview said, I wasn't there.
Yeah.
I didn't play.
One thing about that stands out too, and I know we talked about this, but that one interview with Ringo where he says, and then the writers would come in.
Right.
Like, he was not going to say that's when Paul and John come in. That's when the writers come in. Hey, listen, Mike, I want to switch gears for a second because we got to hit on Paul is Dead.
Yep.
And here's the question I want to ask you, because I got to tell you, Mike, I like you, Mike. I found out about this probably, when I was about 8 years old, when it had just come on the radio. And so this has been a lifelong thing for me. There's two things I really hang my hat on. I want to get from you. I'm going to ask you the top three things that you really hang your head on and you point to and say, this proves, Paul is dead. Here are the top two things that I can never get away from. And I want you to get a little bit into these stories. And then I want to get your top stories. Number one, when Billy got busted for the marijuana in Japan, which to me, that story right there, when I read that in memoirs, that blew me away. Here's the second thing that has always been haunting to me, Mike. Heather Mills's interview with Billy Bush. What in God's name is she talking about? Those are the two things I always look at. Oh, and also Olivia Harrison saying, hello, Billy. Like, I mean, and Dana Carvey. Carvey in the interview, matter of fact, me and Billy, like those things, I'm like, if I had to point to anything, look at those. What I want you to get a little into those things, unless there's something you point to that supersedes all that.
Well, before Sally Whitty, who was another researcher, colleague of mine, because I'm network into half a dozen or so. It's a loose network of researchers, and we share ideas and information that we have. But Sally's been on the show, and she's a colleague and a very good friend. She is blind in her left eye, and we had this page. It's a Facebook page. I'm not really on Facebook, but I was part of this particular page because it was it had a few of us on that page, and we would share ideas. And Sally kept putting these images up and these videos up of Billy and his eye. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, where is she going with this? Now, going back to 2019, I did a presentation that had to do with Vivian Stanshall, that Billy played the role of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. Okay. And when I did that presentation, I came across an image of Stanshall and an image of Billy, an older Billy.
I want to interrupt you real quick before I forget. But Mike, I can't. I got to tell you, I got so many brand members. Every time they want to pop me, they throw this at me, and we give you credit for the Street Viv. Street Viv. We always talk about Street Viv. But go on, man. I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah. So Street Viv is actually his first name is Victor, and he calls himself Victor Stanshall. He was hired by Billy in the 1970s. That's the date that I determined when Billy brought him in to hire him to play the part of Vivian Stanshall. Vivian Stanshall is not a real person. It's a character that was invented by Billy. And Billy played the role of Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band. But in order for Billy to have both of his roles, the Stanshall role and the McCartney role, to coexist, he had to hire somebody so that he wouldn't have the Batman and Bruce Wayne effect, right? They couldn't be in the same room at the same time.
Right.
So we won't get into that, but just it's an interesting story. And you can go to my...
We won't get into it. Who mysteriously died in the fire?
Died in the fire, 1995. So when you go into Wikipedia, you see Vivian Stanshall died. That's Victor that they're talking about. Okay.
Right, go ahead, man. I hate to interrupt you, but if I forget these little things, go ahead.
Yeah. So I have this image of Billy as Stanshall and Billy as McCartney, and I'm looking at the images, and I noticed that Billy's left eye looked like it was drifting to the left, like he had a lazy or wandering eye. So for me, that was substantiating that he did play the role of Stanshall, because what are the odds that if they're two different people, that they would have the same eye anomaly? Right. So you're kind of closing the gap on this thing and determining that, it is the same guy. So I was just thinking that Billy had a lazy eye, and it wandered a little bit. To cut to the chase, Sally's research said no. The reason why his left eye is doing that is because his right eye is an ocular prosthetic. He's blind in his right eye. And so she took me through her evidence, both video and still images.
And this is all on stage of Quay.
Yes.
You guys can see all this, all on stage of Quay. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. So where we could see that Billy's his right eye, which he's blinded, although he has very good motion with both eyes, in other words, they're in sync, they move together, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the right eye, which he's blinded, doesn't track exactly with the left eye. And I've noticed that it happens many times when he looks hard left. So when Billy looks hard left, his left eye looks hard left, but his right eye does not.
Doesn't follow.
It'll look left, but it's more center left versus hard left.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went through this, and once we presented Sally's research, it's not my research, it's her research. She gets full credit for this. Billy came out with an interview. He did the Eyes of the Storm interview. Now, Eyes of the Storm was an exhibit of photos that were allegedly taken by Paul McCartney back in 1964, like the height of Beatlemania. So there was this exhibit. And interesting, it was referred to as Eyes of the Storm. So Billy is being interviewed by, I think it was on CBS, by this person. And they stop at this one particular photograph. And so the interviewer says, that's a great photograph. You really have to have an eye to take something like that. And so Billy he moves his head forward like he's looking at the image, steps back and he goes, my left eye. So he was saying, I only have sight in my left eye. There's also a clip, I think it's from Give My Regards to Broad Street, that movie he came out with in the 1980s, where almost the exact same dialogue is said again. So that was back in the 80s, 40 years ago. And then I think the interview with CBS was last year or earlier this year. So that was the way we looked at that, is that was Billy validating that it's true. He does not have sight in his left eye. Now, what he's doing is a technique that Freemasons use, referred to as masterfully speaking. So masterfully speaking just means that they can speak in encoded ways to reveal the truth, but it's encoded. Yeah. So you have to understand.
This is the Letterman interview.
Yes, in 2009.
Right. Okay.
Yes. The Letterman interview, he did that, and he masterfully speaks there, and it's great. It's brilliant. Both him and Letterman were both masterfully speaking, and you're watching two very high-level Freemasons, and I believe Billy's in the Illuminated degrees, but that's a discussion for another day. Bantering back and forth. That interview came out right after Wired magazine, from out of Italy, the Italian version of Wired magazine, released an article that had to do with two forensic experts taking a look into Paul McCartney to determine whether he was replaced or not. Now, these two Italian researchers, and they are forensic researchers, they're not just two hacks. These are two people that really know what they're doing. When they engaged in taking a look into the whole Paul is dead thing, they believe that Paul has always been Paul. And so through their forensic work, they were going to be able to close the door on his, just
once and for all.
Once and for all, hey, this is done. Okay, so stop at all the silliness. He's the same guy. What happened was, once they got into the analysis, they realized it wasn't the same guy. And so the more they looked, the more they were convinced that there's something going on here. These are not the same two people. And that article, it did come out. It's very difficult to find on the internet. I believe it was scrubbed. So that came out, and when it was released, that's when Billy went on to Letterman to talk about the whole Paul is dead conspiracy and the silliness of it and all that stuff. But as he's masterfully speaking, he's actually telling us, yes, it's true. I'm not Paul McCartney.
Yeah, I'm the guy. I'm the guy. I'm the guy.
I'm the guy.
Yeah.
I'm the guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
A very good double. I'm the guy.
Yeah.
So, we have situations like that. So the eye is the biggest, to me, is the proof point, because biological Paul didn't have a ocular prosthetic. He had two good eyes.
Mike, there was something very interesting, and you had to see this. I can't remember who it was, but it just came out. There was a YouTube video, and it was called, I think it was called Whispers from Memoirs. Did you see this? And there were decoded deep messages throughout that. And one of the messages, because they shouted you out, and who's the woman who came up with this?
Sally.
They shouted you guys out because one of the hidden messages and the whispers were about him having a prosthetic eye. I mean, did you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. Okay, so that you probably watched that on Kat's Supernatural Beatles channel.
Yeah.
She got into the whisper messages. In fact, I asked if I could mirror it on my site. She did such a great job, and she said, sure. So
can you explain exactly what that is, though, Mike, a whisper message? Because I didn't really understand how she was decoding this. What is that?
Okay, so let me just say this. The Sally's eye discovery made its way into memoirs, not only in the whisper messages, but also within the footnotes that Tom put together. So it's there now. The same thing happened with my work as it pertains to whether the Beatles wrote all their own music and played on all the recorded tracks. Once I came out with that, Memoirs was updated and to validate my work. So my work was validated and Sally's work was validated. Now, whisper messages are part of the layering within the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. So if you just read The Memoirs of Billy Shears, like any other book, you read everything from left to right, you're going to get a narrative. But there are layers of encoding. So the next layer of encoding would be what's referred to as word stacking. So word stacking means that there are words, bolded out words on each page within Memoirs. When you read the bolded out words as standalone, now you have more information because it forms more sentences. The next layer is referred to as the acrostical code, where the first letter of every odd numbered sentence, when you take the first letter, beginning of the sentence, and you read vertically, it forms more information or more sentences. So that's another layer. Another layer is the fact that the book leads you or actually encourages you to research outside the book. And that's what happened with me with the music. That wasn't in the book. I saw the hint. I saw the clue that was dropped, which most people would just breeze right by. I'm like, no, something's going on here. So that's another aspect of layering, where the book is inviting intrepid readers to go outside and, test the waters and either debunk it or see if what is being said is true. Now, Memoirs is historical fiction. The book is very clear about that. And the reason for that is because it requires plausible deniability, because Billy and Tom and everybody else involved has signed non-disclosure agreements. So it has to have threads of historical fiction. Now, another layer is which was introduced probably, I'm trying to remember when, maybe an edition or two ago, where there's very faint font written at either the top, the side, or the bottom of a page. It's very faint, where it's giving more information about disclosure. Now, some of the information in the whisper messages I would refer to as esoteric. It gets into more of Billy's occultism, but other whisper messages are not. I mean, they're just, even a person that's not, doesn't have an understanding of occultism and mythology, as an example, like the Egyptian mysteries, there are whisper messages that have nothing to do with that. You just read them as they are, and it's giving you more information. So the Memoirs of Billy Shears, think of it as a big puzzle. It's a big Masonic puzzle. And it's there to make you think. And it's for people, like I mentioned before, who are intrepid. They will analyze the book and look for the clues. This is how Stacy, another researcher, who this I got to say, Stacy, I know you're probably listening to this. I mean, you are. I told her she is one smart cookie. This lady. But in the book, it kind of leads us down a path to kind of ponder, or maybe even believe, that Aleister Crowley was Billy's biological father. But Stacy looked at other passages within the book and other clues and deducted that no, Crowley is not his father. Doesn't mean he wasn't tutored by Crowley. It just means that Crowley is not his biological father, and that his actual bloodline, blue bloods going back to Scotland, are the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys. On the Percy side, which is his mother's side of the house, there's Campbell blood. So sometimes people will say, oh, he's William Campbell. And in the book, he says, I have Campbell blood. I have Campbell relatives. So I think that she broke the code on that, to be honest with you, Vince. One of the reasons is because, and Tom, if you're listening to this, feel free to comment. I sent that presentation to Tom twice.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
And both times when I sent it to him, I didn't get a response back, that's not what Tom usually does. So if I send something to Tom, he will respond one way or another. He'll say, oh, that's interesting. Or he'll say, you're on the right path, or whatever. Nothing. Because I think the reason for that, and again, this is conjecture on my part, being speculative, is because even though Billy tells us that the identity of his parents are encoded in the book, I don't think that he thought that anybody was going to be able to figure it out, to decode it. And because once you decode it, which Stacy, I believe, did, or at least her case is very compelling, that opens up a can of worms, right, when you think about it. So people will really start looking into the Douglas Hamilton bloodline, the Percy bloodline. And so in order to kind of keep it under wraps, you just don't respond. It's like the Streisand effect, right? If you keep talking about it, you tell people don't look at something, they look at it.
Yeah.
If you just be quiet, it just kind of dies on the vine.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably the tactic that's being used. Again, this is conjecture on my part, but I thought her research was great.
Mike, have you ever wanted to go down the Tom U. Harriet hole? Now, because I there has to be a part of you. Now, I know you have dialogue with him. He gives you information, and you in no way or shape want to ever break that, bond and trust, because you're the only one that has that. Have you ever really looked into who this guy is?
I made an assumption that Tom is a real person, okay, and he is a real person. I made an assumption because in the very beginning you're wondering, is he real? Is he using an alias, and so on? But now I have a professional relationship with Tom, so we're not beer drinking buddies or anything like that. And most of our correspondences come in the form of messages or emails, where a lot of times it has to do with me asking him a question about a certain passage in the book and looking for clarification. I do not divulge to Tom what I'm working on, or what I was working on when I was doing the research, and Tom never divulged to me what he was putting in the book. He might say, I'm working on updating the book. Okay, well, that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't give me any details, right? So we didn't share our information, and I wasn't going to do that. Now, Tom, going back, did mail me a copy of the book. He signed it for me. Okay, and now I should also say that even though that was a free copy of the book, all of the versions that I worked from, I purchased. Mm-hmm. This was kind of after the fact, because I do believe at some point this book is going to have a lot of importance as it pertains to the Beatles. And of course, he had an address, and it was his home address. And it's not too hard to figure out whether that address exists.
Wow.
And the thing is, Hugh Harriet is not a common name, but it's also not. He's not the only person walking around with the surname of Hugh Harriet.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't believe me, go do a search on the surname of Hugh Harriet, and what you'll see is there are other people who have the last name of Hugh Harriet. Tom's got 5 kids, and their last names are Hugh Harriet. So he's a real person.
Okay.
He has a Facebook page. Tom is he's very active on his Facebook page. I mean, I'm not on Facebook. I have an alias that I use in order to work with the particular Facebook forum page that we have between the other researchers, but I don't interact on Facebook. And the other reason why I have an alias is because I occasionally sell guitars.
Got you.
On Marketplace, right? So, but as far as having a personal Facebook page, a Sage of Quay Facebook page, interacting as myself or Sage of Quay on Facebook, I do not do that. I left Facebook years ago.
Yeah.
It's just a big, to me, it's just a big black hole of nothingness. So Tom is a real person. And I know that Sally has actually met Tom.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So, so he exists. Yeah. unless Tom sent a very good double to represent him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, street Tom.
Street Tom.
Hey, Mike, I got to talk to you about 2 more things.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. We all know the clues. Like, come on, listen, guys. I'm not at the kindergarten level. I'm at the Mike. I'm at this. I'm of the school of Mike Williams. We all know the clues. The clues are right in front of your face. Hundreds of them. We all know the clues. I buried Paul. Okay. Sharon Clements.
Yeah.
Was on your show.
Yeah.
I'm going to give her a shout out. Foreign Fruit. She writes this book called Foreign Fruit.
Forbidden Fruit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Forbidden Fruit. I'm sorry. I got it right over here. Forbidden Fruit. Wow. Here's my first question. This is the first question I want to ask you. The reason I said so many clues are on the level and right in front of our face, as simple as Billy saying, "I am that guy." Okay, he's looking at the camera. I am. You can't get any more clear than that. I buried Paul. We know them all. However, in her book, these are things that are like not even below the surface. I'm talking about buried at the bottom of the ocean. The scenarios and the stories, that she came up with and the theories are so deep. And what she really does is she breaks it down to words. She pulls out certain words. She really studies the words. And we're going to talk about this in a second. But in her hypothesis, everything leads to Washington.
Seattle, yeah.
Seattle, Washington. We're going to talk about that in a minute. I want to talk about the Illuminati Circle of 300 and how this works. And this is where it gets a little muddy to me because they tell us in plain sight. They tell like that. That's part of the code. We got to tell them. We got to let them know they're never going to believe it anyway. That's part of the code. So part of the McCartney myth is all these clues are right in front of your face. We are telling you, you're never going to believe this. You're going to be conspiracy theorists, crazy. But with the research she did, it is not on the surface. And it is so very, very, very deep that I'm almost thinking, unless she was sent to you, because I'm thinking was Sharon, because first of all, Mike, she had the shades on for the whole interview. All right, what's going on with the shades there? A little, I'm saying to myself, was Sharon purposely sent to Mike to lay out these things that we may have missed? Because to me, to her credit, two things. Number one, there are too many things that are too coincidental. And number two, I always wanted to believe that a lot of the songs with gibberish really meant something. I never wanted to believe I Am the Walrus is just gibberish. I always wanted to believe these words mean something. So what I'm trying to say is this part of their game plan? Like, in other words, is there a level where they put it right out in front of our face? And then is there that second level where they hide things much, much deeper that are maybe a little bit more dangerous? Because what she's talking about is not a car crash. She's talking about a sacrifice.
Yes.
That's what she's talking about here, a satanic ritual. I mean, gets very descriptive at the end of the book, and I don't want to ruin it for her. And, actually, if she could sell it, great. But where she goes is very deep, very dark, very satanic. Yep. Is this the way they work, Mike, where they're working on two different levels? Like, okay, everybody can see this here. This is really simple. But if you want to really get down to what our practice is, we're going to tell you, but you're never going to find it. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What do you think about all that? Please tell me. I read this book and it blew me away.
Yeah. So I talked about the ritual sacrifice possibilities going back to 2018 in my presentation, The Beatles, Paul McCartney and the Grand Illusion. I talked about that premise, and I brought it up many times that it was a possibility. Billy refers to it in the book as death for success. So these ritual sacrifices,
making a deal with the devil.
Yeah, a Faustian bargain, right?
Yeah.
And we're told in the book that John Lennon and Paul McCartney made the pact in October of 1963. I think it was October 24th of 63 is what we're told in the book. And so now I'm going to say that these pacts, based upon my research, they do exist.
Do you think this is what the 27 Club is all about?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought, okay.
Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, John Bonham of Led Zeppelin, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix,
Janis Joplin.
I mean, we can go on and on and on, right?
Amy Winehouse.
Yep. And so it does exist, and it's not just the 27 Club. You'll see people dying at different ages. I'm not going to get into it because the numerology piece of this really gets some people kind of jammed up. But I look at the ages in which people die, and I completely, I should say completely, I can see that these numbers are occulted numbers. So I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so now with Sharon's work, again, like Stacy's, very compelling. Now, I don't know Sharon's background. I'm going to assume that she's just a very smart person, very intrepid, and has very good research and investigative skills. And the reason why I say that, folks, is because when I came out with my work, when I was looking into the music and all of this, people accused me of being on the payroll, working with Tom, Billy's payroll.
People have said, Mike, that you are Tom. People have actually
yes,
said that.
They said,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, Tom and I are two different people, but people say stupid things all the time. And but I've been accused of those types of things, basically, being a plant, and I'm not. I'm not a plant. My research and my investigative skills is something that I've always had my whole life. And the work that I did in the corporate world had to do with financial analysis, very detailed financial analysis, building scenarios, looking at data, assessing data, looking at patterns and trends and stuff like that. I mean, so that's basically look at it as that's my skill set.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody put me here. I just went ahead and did my thing. So I'm going to say that Sharon is coming from the same path. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But her work, like I said, is very compelling. And because what happens, folks, is I'll give you a brief overview. So she focused a lot on the song I Am the Walrus. And she said, in the song I Am the Walrus, there are all of these clues that point to Seattle. And of course, the Beatles' last concert was in Seattle. And many researchers believe that it was after the Seattle concerts that Paul was never seen again.
They had two more, wasn't it? Seattle, LA, and San Francisco, right? So there were two more after Seattle.
Yeah, and I guess the premise would be that maybe they had a stand-in or a lookalike play for those concerts.
And it's very hard. It's very hard, Mike. It's very hard to find footage of those last two concerts that weren't taken by fans where you can really make anything out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have always said that whether Paul died in August, September, or November, those are the three time frames. Late August, September 11th, which is what we're told in the book, or November 9th, because that's 9/11 inverted. That I've always said, look, I don't major on that because dead is dead.
Yeah.
So whether you died in August, September, or November, I don't know. I'm not going to die on a hill for that one. Now, after the show, I did talk to Sharon, and I said, she believes he died in August. I said, but the book really, really drills in on September 11th. And September 11th is a very important date in the occult. September 11th in occultism from the world of the controllers is referred to as a day of war. It could be actual physical war or psychological war. And we just talked about this back and forth. Neither one of us landed in a particular spot. I wasn't looking to convince her of anything. I mean, she can make her mind up about, where she wants to land with her own research. But I said perhaps that the actual ritual had a span of time. So that span of time took it from late August to September 11th, where it culminated on September 11th of 1966. So, I'm not an occultist. I'm not involved in occult ritual. So I don't know what all goes on when these types of things go down, if in fact it went down. So now the other thing too, and I alluded to this during the show with Sharon, John Lennon did not write I Am the Walrus.
Yeah, no, yeah, you were, great points about that. Go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
Because if what Sharon was presenting is true or accurate, then how would John Lennon have that level of knowledge, very intricate knowledge of Seattle and Seattle locations?
No way.
There's no way.
No.
So what that says is, again, Sharon's work is very compelling, and if she's correct, then John Lennon did not write I Am the Walrus. That song was written for him, where the clues were embedded into the lyrics, and his job, just like with Rubber Soul, was to sing it.
Yeah.
John Lennon was quoted in an interview saying that there's only about 100 people that really understand the Beatles' music. Also, John Lennon in the early 1970s, I think it was 71, in Rolling Stone magazine, said that the Beatles were a myth, Paul McCartney's a myth, Bob Dylan is a myth. John Lennon came out with a song on his Imagine album, How Do You Sleep? Mm-hmm. It's the quintessential Paul is Dead song. If you read memoirs and then you listen to John's song, or listen to John's song and then read memoirs, it's completely stitched together.
Yeah.
So John Lennon was dropping a lot of clues, as was George Harrison.
If Sharon's work is correct, does it surprise you that those clues are so embedded that they would almost be impossible to find? Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me, because when you think about it, memoirs is the same thing. Memoirs is the same thing.
Yeah.
Everything's embedded. It's encoded, right? I talked about Stacy. Stacy picked up on certain passages in memoirs that took her off to take a look at the Douglas Hamilton and Percy bloodlines, that being Billy's family tree, his lineage. Again, do we know for sure? No. Is her work compelling? Absolutely, just like Sharon's. So this deep encoding, this is what occultism is all about, Vince. When we talk about the esoteric and the occult, this is how they play. This is how they play ball. And it's very difficult for just about most people, 99.9% of the population, to really get their heads wrapped around, because that's not our world.
Yeah, right. Totally foreign.
It's totally foreign. And so when you're introduced to it or you're being told about it, your initial inclination is,
because you don't understand it. So
because you don't understand it.
Yeah.
So, but this world is,
So Mike, now I got to ask you this, because Sharon's explanation, and this made sense. This made total sense. Sharon said that the car accident was a way to explain to his family, because if Paul really had died, you had to tell his close-knit family something. That's where the car accident, came up, because we're not going to tell him, well, yeah, we killed him in a satanic ritual. We're not going to tell that to his family. But so do you buy that theory? I mean, is the car accident, the picking up the hitch, is all that just the cover of this? Do you believe that?
I think it could very well be a cover story talking about a car accident. I don't know if it was put together so that it could be told to Paul's family to make it more palatable, that, that's how he died and so on. I have no idea. That's speculative, and but it's okay. I mean, it's a hypothesis. It's okay. I have hypothesized and speculated that Paul's father, Jim McCartney, was a Freemason, and he was part of the whole process to. I think he may have been his initial handler and getting him prepped for what Tavistock had in mind, down the road. So in Lennon's case, it would have been his uncle, as is explained in memoirs. His father, Freddie, was missing in action. Freddie just wasn't there. And his mother died when John was young. He was raised by his Aunt Mimi. Paul McCartney's mother passed away when he was 17. So we have this broken family. We have this level of dysfunction, which can be indicative of kids who would be identified and pulled into programs, mind control programs. All right. I'm not saying that it's always the case, but when you do the research, you find that type of family dynamic where it's broken up. It's a pool of resource that they can pull from, and I think it's very possible that Paul's father was a Freemason.
Wow.
And because when you think about it, who would agree?
Yeah.
To have somebody replace your son. Think about that.
Yeah.
We're going to honor your son, and Billy's going to play him, and you're just going to be so proud of what Billy's going to put out and under the McCartney name and so on. I mean, if it were me, I'd be like, get lost.
Yeah.
So. So all I can do is with regard to Sharon's work is to say I did the show with her. Take a listen, and or if you're really, really interested, buy the book.
Yeah. What was interesting too about her book, I do want to say, it did for me. It added a lot more meaning to Magical Mystery Tour to me. Yeah. So I mean, because you read her book, then you go back and you watch it, which you've never understood anything up until this point, but when you go back and watch it with her research, it does make it a little bit more clear.
Yeah, I think they started filming Magical Mystery Tour on September 11th. Wow. So there's the date again. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up with this, Mike, because I could talk to you for hours. Mike, I am 1,000% convinced Tavistock is alive and well.
Oh, yeah.
And I believe without a shadow of a doubt that Taylor Swift was made in a laboratory. This is, I don't know if she was 12 or 11 or 13, but all of a sudden this 12-year-old girl from God knows where moves to Nashville, Tennessee, and is in the studio with some of the greatest musicians in the history of country and Western. It goes as far, Mike. I know we spoke about this last time. Like, this is like people think we're crazy, Mike. Mike, they were interviewing grown women after Taylor Swift's era tour. They didn't remember the concert.
Right.
Please, Mike, tell me I'm wrong, and explain to me how Tavistock would go about making the next superstar that is, going to mold the youth of tomorrow. I mean, because, and also let's remember this, Mike. She endorsed Kamala Harris.
Yes.
So walk me through this and tell me if I'm crazy or not.
Well, we have to understand that social engineering, mind control, conditioning, that has been around for since day one. And when we talk about Tavistock actually came out of Wellington House, which was the propaganda arm of the British military and intelligence from World War I. All right, so they were responsible for all the propaganda that came out. And so from Wellington House, in 1921, it became the Tavistock Clinic. And the Tavistock Clinic, what they were doing was taking soldiers from World War I and who had shell shock. And the premise was that they were going to do research and analyze the soldiers with shell shock and figure out psychological components and all of that. Very convenient when you think about it, right? They have an instant inventory of patients or subjects that they can work on. I'm not going to say work with, work on. Then they became the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, I believe it was in 1947. But the reason why I'm taking you through that history, folks, is because Tavistock has been around for 100 years, for a century, as an entity. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, they are headquarters, the hub for the social engineering and the brainwashing and the conditioning and the indoctrination that takes place throughout the deep state, the shadow government, the Illuminati, however you want to label them. There is a deep state shadow government control matrix that runs this world. That's why you have things like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Bank. You have the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, the World Court. Everything is, if you see the word international or world in front of it, okay, that is the overarching structure that's running the show. And everything underneath that is a puppet show. It's what's taking place in front of the curtain.
It's a controlled puppet show.
It's a controlled puppet show. So all the people that are on the public stage, all of your presidents, your prime ministers, and all that stuff, they all work for this deep state. And I've mentioned many times in other shows that the president of the United States, at best, would be mid-level management within the pyramid. It's called the pyramid of power. And they're kind of like in the middle somewhere. And so they have bosses. They have people that write their job descriptions for them and tell them what it is that they're going to do and what it is they're not going to do. Presidents do not have the power that you think they do, nor do prime ministers. So we'll leave that there. So what happens, Vince, is it's very hard for a lot of people to really, really come to grips with this. But so many people work or operate within that system, that pyramid of power. These are people that belong to secret societies, primarily, and the overarching secret society would be the Freemasonry. But there are many, many different secret societies, and what the what the secret societies and the controllers are very good at doing is setting aside their differences, because they do have differences in how they're going to go about things. But they set that aside because they agree on the final objective, which is total control. It's one world, everything. And for those that don't see this happening or see this coming, I don't know what to tell you. You have to do some more research. What you might want to do is to go to the website of the World Economic Forum, where they are just blatantly putting it all out there with 15-minute cities and surveillance this and surveillance that and digital ID, digital currency, and all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is not conspiracy anymore. It may have been conspiracy 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but this stuff is sitting right on top of our heads right now. It's on our doorstep. So you have all of you have a population of people that are tied into this system. And so what happens is this is their world. And because it's their world, they're plugged in as resources, not only like the parents, but potentially the children as well. And so people are identified at certain stages of their life as having the potential to be able to help push the agenda forward in some capacity. So they could be earmarked as a politician. They could be earmarked as an international corporation, a CEO, some kind of financial mogul, and so on. These people are all in the system.
Entertainers, big time.
Entertainers, depending upon where they are in the entertainment industry.
Right.
But it's tiered. So I don't want everybody to think that if a particular celebrity's at the top. They're not. But it's a pyramid. So it emanates from the very top, and there's all kinds of debates as to who really sits at the top of this pyramid. But just it's well enough to understand that below that, it's a corporate structure. So the way it works is the same way a corporation works. So if a corporation, let's say the CEO of a major corporation decides that this is where he or she wants to take the company. So a strategy is formulated. The strategy is formulated at the very top of the corporate structure, the corporate pyramid. And then that strategy then is pushed down to the lower levels within the corporation to have that strategy executed and put into play, to have it deployed. Mm-hmm. And to do that, there are different functions and there are different skill sets and resources, people that do this type of work. And so that's how it works. It gets pushed down. So I have explained that, I'm sorry it's taking a little long to explain, but I found that there were 3 tiers. There are those who are bloodlined. So if they're bloodlined into the elite families, they're going to be tapped for certain positions of power and influence throughout the world. And it could be governments, it could be the media, it could be whatever, the corporate matrix, the corporatocracy. Then you have those who may not be bloodlined, but they're in the secret societies. Well, I'll pick on Freemasonry. So in Freemasonry, their oaths trump everything. So their allegiance is to their oaths, which is referred to as their obligations. So that would be the second tier, in which they're going to pull to bring people in to do the work of the pyramid. Below that are people that are outside the pyramid that are scouted and pulled in. So they're lured in by, they could have, let's say, parents who are in the military or in intelligence. That's one piece of it. Or they can have parents that have no linkages into the military or intelligence, but they're just out there. And let's just say they do have skills and they are talented. They're brought in, and then their talent is manipulated. It's handlers come in, they're groomed to play a certain part. And the way it works is carrots are dangled. So they bring
Man,
somebody
I
in.
swear, I hate to interrupt you, Mike, but I feel like you're telling me the Howard Stern story. I that's what I feel like you're telling me. But go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I know that I know a person who was very accomplished in the music industry. He told me stories that had to do with himself. He never took the bait. But what happens is when you don't take the bait, let's say you're very skilled and you are accomplished, you could still play in the system, and you're going to contribute to the structure above you in making money. They'll pay you money, but they're going to make money too.
Yeah.
A lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also there's a ceiling for those types of people.
Yeah.
So they won't go any higher. So what will happen is they hit a ceiling, boom, boom, they can't get past it. But what happens is they dangle the carrot.
Right.
And the carrot is, hey, let's do this. You want to be famous? I can make you famous. And a lot of times these people are very young. And so the whole fame and fortune and the celebrity just like, yeah, I'll do that. And so they sign on the dotted line. And they get some work done. It's very incremental and methodical the way they do it, by the way. I mean, so it's not, they bring it along because it has to be done through consent. You have to consent to it.
Right. Right.
So let's say you get a taste of success. Then they come back and say, that was pretty good, huh? You like that? A lot of money? The popularity?
Sounds like the devil.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And then you say, yeah. And then you say, yeah, I love it. I love it. You know, you want more? Oh, yeah, I want more.
Yeah.
So then what happens is now you're going to the second rung on the ladder, and the third and the fourth. And the more you keep going, the darker and darker it gets. And that's the process in a nutshell. I mean, we could take a look at what's going on with Sean Combs, P. Diddy.
Yeah. Let's take a look at that. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm just saying, here's a situation where this stuff is coming out, how this works with his freak offs and all of this stuff. It was just incredible amounts of degeneracy and totally dark, satanic, occulted stuff that was taking place and still taking place. I mean, this stuff is so embedded in the entertainment and the music business today. It's unbelievable. I mean, really, when people talk about it being a dark place to work, it really is a dark place.
Now, here's always my question, Mike, when something like this happens, when all of a sudden Diddy's outed and Diddy's in jail.
Right.
Is that them? Are they now punishing Diddy for maybe something he did against the system? Is that how it works? Because if somebody's embedded and then all of a sudden they're outed, they're Weinstein, whatever, is that part of the system? You effed up. Here you go.
Yeah, it could be that. It could also be that they will take some of their own and throw them under the bus. And the reason why they do that is because it's a major league distraction. So as an example.
Got you. Go ahead. People
will look at Sean Combs or P. Diddy. P. Diddy's so stupid to say that. But in any case, people will look at him and think that he's the pinnacle. He's the zenith of the problem. When in fact, he's low level.
Right.
So by taking him and throwing him in jail,
it's the old look over here, don't look over there.
Right. So all of the attention he gets, it's the same thing they did with Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah.
Right. That's still going. That's still going on. And people still want to see the Epstein's flight logs and all of this stuff. People are still spinning their wheels on this stuff. Another great example of that is Jimmy Savile. Now, that's not to say that Jimmy Savile wasn't a repugnant, reprehensible person, but Jimmy Savile was not, like I said, the pinnacle or the zenith of all of this dark stuff that takes place with human and sex trafficking and all of the ritual abuse. So think about what they did with Jimmy Savile. The revelations about what he was involved in didn't come out when he was alive. It was revealed after he passed away. That's because dead men don't talk.
Yeah.
And then what happens is the public looks at that, especially those that are paying attention to this stuff, and say, well, we got him. We got him. We got him. This was a big win, a big win. Well, it's a win, maybe. In Savile's case, he died, so I don't know what you want, other than the fact that it was post-mortem that it came out what he was involved in. But it's the same thing with P. Diddy. I mean, honestly, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I think it's going to be one of those wheel-spinning exercises like Jeffrey Epstein, where people are going to think that, they got a big fish, when the fact of the matter is you didn't get a big fish.
God, Mike, I can't help but as you're talking about this, I can't help thinking about Vince McMahon. Could he have been in one of those very, very similar situations with what he's dealing with now?
I don't know, Vince. It could be. I don't know. All we can do is speculate and maybe create a hypothesis. It can't even become a theory, because a theory is something that you can actually test over and over again. But the way I look at it is just about anybody that has achieved a level of fame and fortune that is in the upper echelon of fame and fortune is suspect. I'm sorry. This is going back to the Beatles. How anybody believes that a band comprised of 4 guys that were working class scousers out of Liverpool were organic and achieved the fame and fortune that they did, unprecedented, and think that there was nothing going on, that there was no machine behind them, there was nothing, nobody was grooming them, nobody was handling them, that none of that took place. It's the height of being naive.
Yeah, and Mike, that's what I say about Taylor Swift, because I always say when you look at Taylor Swift, Mike, off the top of my head, I can name 25 better female singers, 25 better female guitar players, 25 better female songwriters. She's average. I mean, she literally is average, and the spot that she's in, that's not going to happen on your own if you're an average person.
No, she's a complete and total manufactured entity. Now, Tavistock is great at a lot of things, but 2 things that they really excel at is creating cults and reducing the thinking of an adult to that of a child. Because when you reduce an adult's thinking down to a childlike level, it's emotion-based.
Yeah.
They're not using adult reasoning and logic. Everything is knee-jerk. It's very emotional. I see this all the time with the Beatles stuff. So Taylor Swift and her Swifties are a cult, just like the Beatles are a cult. And pick any band. I mean, there's the cult of Elon Musk. Mm-hmm. There's the cult of Trump. There's the cult of Biden and Kamala Harris. These are all, people are placed in buckets, and they have belief systems. And these belief systems that they have, they're so attached to them that it dictates how they behave, how they react. And so Taylor Swift, she's 35 years old now. She was born in 1989, if I'm not mistaken. And if you go onto Wikipedia, Vince and I talked about this in one of the shows that we did previously. You take a look at her list of accomplishments for somebody at that time. She was 34 years old when we did that show. It's ludicrous. It's absolutely unbelievable. There's no way that she accomplished all of this. She's a prop. She's somebody that's manufactured, and she's put out into the public eye, and you're told stories. These are called official narratives. You're told stories about Taylor Swift. Are they true? I'm going to say no, they're not true. They're not true. And so she was groomed, and she was handled, and she was brought along to be who she is today. One of the things I wanted to, real quickly, Vince, I know we're short on time. Her tour is called the Eras Tour, like an era, plural. So if you take a look at the definition of era, an era is a fixed point in time from which a series of years is reckoned. It can refer to a specific period in history, often characterized by distinct cultural, social, and economic developments. So Taylor Swift is very often referred to as a cultural phenomenon, just like the Beatles were. In fact, many times she's compared to the Beatles. I have some articles here. I picked up, well, all I did was I typed in Taylor Swift and Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
Sky News. She now transcends even the highest echelons of pop fame, massively boosting everything from music sales to the entire global economy. Now, do you think that this is just some innocent old girl that picked up an acoustic guitar and started strumming a couple of basic chords and started writing music? No. Well, if you're in a position where you are in the echelon of pop fame, and newspaper articles or online articles are written saying that you are a main contributor to the entire global economy, well, you know what? You're manufactured.
Yeah.
So, Billy Joel was saying that she knows music and she knows how to write. She's like this generation's Beatles.
Ringo literally within the past week put her over huge. Ringo himself. Yeah. And when I saw that, I'm like, yeah, of course you're going to put that over, right?
Yeah, here's another one from The Week. This is from online magazine called The Week from June of 2024. So this is recent. The British Geological Survey estimated that the audience reaction at Murrayfield Stadium had an effect similar to a 2.3 magnitude earthquake. I don't know if that's true. I mean, I don't know if that's another nonsense story, but what they're doing is, my point is they're playing her up.
Yeah, of course.
Building her up. And here's the thing, right? Here's, so the Beatles comparison. Here's Taylor Swift. And look who she's with.
Yeah. Look at that. Yeah.
So what you have to realize, folks, is what the deep state did, the shadow government, the Illuminati, again, whatever name you want to give them, they pulled everybody away from their traditional and ancestral traditions. Because if you are tied to that and you have an affinity for your traditions, then they can't move their ball forward. So what they did was, through their television sets and their magazines and their radios and their music and their Hollywood and everything else, was to deliver to you pop music and pop culture. So the culture that you reside in today is not your traditional or ancestral culture. It's popular culture. What's pop culture? Pop culture is Netflix, hamburgers, hot dogs, beers, sports, Elon Musk, politics. This is all pop culture. It's not real. What is real? Well, real means that you have to get rid of all that stuff and get back to who you are inward as a person, your inner person. So you have to do your inner work to figure out what that is. What they've done is they've done an unbelievable job of just shaping and conditioning the population to a point where people they follow like sheep. So they put a shepherd out front. A shepherd could be a guy like Elon Musk. Just pick anybody. It's a celebrity, an entertainer, a songwriter, whatever, a band, and people follow. And that's why it's very difficult for us to get out from underneath all of the chaos and the dysfunction that we are witnessing today and have been for many years, for decades, because people, they don't see it. There are people that do see it, and it's very frustrating for those people, but most of the population hasn't a clue.
I always say, Mike, to me, the most unbelievable thing that I always point to is, Mike, they had us fighting over toilet paper.
Yes.
Okay, that's what they minimized us down to, fighting over toilet paper.
Yeah, and they gaslight, Vince. I mean, they put mandates in effect at the corporate world and told people that if you didn't do what they told you to do, that you were going to lose your job, and many people did lose their jobs. And then they turned around after the event miraculously just evaporated and disappeared, and then turned around and said, we never forced anybody to do anything.
Yep. Unbelievable.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Mike, we could talk for hours. I want to get something straight, though, about going forward. So Sage of Quay continues?
Yeah.
Okay. And you do that weekly, or you do it as needed?
As needed. I mean, I just have too many things going on. Right now, I'm working on a major music project where my brother and I are resurrecting old demos that we wrote and recorded back 40 years ago.
Nice. Wow.
And we're reimagining the songs. We're retaining the original essence of the songs and the melodies, but we're doing them, as if we wrote the songs today.
Wow, that's awesome.
And that's going to be about 12 to 15 songs. And I'm just finishing up the 5th song as we speak. So I've got a lot of other things that, I'm focused on. I mentioned, we have 2 grandchildren now. Our grandson is 26 months old now. Our granddaughter, 6 months old.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, so there's just stuff like that, Vince. And, I'm still going to have my head in the game with regard to what goes on in the world and all that stuff. But as far as, like I said, the ongoing Beatles stuff, no. I reached a point of diminishing returns. Now, you put all this effort into it, how much more are you moving the ball forward?
Well, with that being said, Mike, I'm a little surprised with this. You could write, right behind the memoirs of Billy Shears, you could write the ultimate, Paul is dead, Beatles dead. You could write the ultimate book that would be right behind that book. That's a return. Have you not considered that?
I've been asked that many times, and I'm not patting myself on the back, but it would be better than the memoirs of Billy Shears, only from the standpoint because I would talk about things that memoirs is being coy about.
Right.
So where they're kind of like ducking and weaving, I won't duck and weave. I'll just say, this is what I believe happened.
Well, have you entertained that? I
have been asked. I have to be honest with you, Vince. A book is not on my radar right now. It's you wrote books.
Yeah. Mike, the way you do your presentations, writing a book would take you 10 years.
Yeah.
It would be so thorough. Like I know how you are. And for you to write the book that you want to write, I think it would take a decade.
Yeah. And Vince, I'm going to be 67 years old in 2 months. And so my take on it is that, do I want to spend the next 5 to 10 years writing a book about the Beatles, or do I want to go do some more fun stuff in my life?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm
out for the fun stuff.
Yeah, I'm with Mike. I'm about to turn 64, and you and I are on the same exact page.
Yeah.
So Mike, sageofquay.com. Do we want to send them anywhere else?
No, just go to my hub website, sageofquay.com, sageofquay.com. All of my links are there. My links to my music as well. So if you're interested, I have a whole section dedicated to the Beatles conspiracy. Like I said, even though I'm wrapping up the day-to-day research, the ongoing research, there's a ton of stuff there. I have over 300 videos.
Wow, it's
on
amazing.
The topic.
It's amazing. The work Mike has done is amazing. Mike, I can't thank you enough. I love my conversations with you. I have my sons turned on to you. I'm going to be honest with you, Mike, and you mentioned it in passing. I always get lost in the numerology. I'm not good at the numerology, and I always try to follow that. But just the work you've done has been absolutely incredible. None of the work would exist if you were not here. None of this would exist, Mike. And there are just so many people out there that have read this and followed you, and just absolutely amazing work over the years.
Thank you, Vince. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. All right, Mike, don't go anywhere. I just want to personally thank you. But everybody, for me and Mike, please go to Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUY, correct?
QUAY.
QUAY.com. It's fascinating. It's not just Beatles. There's so many great topics on there. And also his Paul is Dead channel is just, related to that. But for the great Mike Williams and myself, we'll see you next time.